Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'll be looking at a video from the guys at Creation Ministries International, but this time instead of looking specifically at evolution or proof of God or anything, we'll be watching their video on climate change. Given how much they have to warp and twist the science in order to get to a creationism position, I'm curious if they'll treat it the same way when it comes to climate change. Okay, I lied. I'm not curious. We know exactly how they'll treat it. But I don't think I've done a video just on climate change before, so here we are. Let's go!
Now, unless you've been living under a rock, the issue that many are near hysterical about is that atmospheric temperature is supposedly going up because humans are producing too much carbon dioxide.
Right.
In simple terms, yes, that is what is happening. As humans pump more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the temperatures have been going up. And it is getting worse as it goes. From 1900 to 1980, a new temperature record was set on average every 13 and a half years. From 1981 to 2019, there was a new record every 3 years. The 10 warmest years on record have all happened since 2005, with the past 7 years being the 7 warmest years on record, with 2021 coming in 6th, even with a La Niña event that had a cooling effect. And it correlates pretty much exactly with carbon dioxide concentration. Of course, correlation itself does not prove causation, and you can see other correlations, like here's a graph of temperatures with solar activity. See how well it correlates? But you might notice that this graph ends in the 1980s. If you continue this chart into modern data, you get something more like this, where the solar activity takes a nosedive while the average temperatures keep climbing. There's a similar level of consensus among climate scientists that the cause of global warming is the human emission of CO2, as there is for evolution. So if you think that climate change is not man-made, then you are standing in direct opposition to 97% of the scientists who spend their entire careers studying that exact thing. And so you are engaging in science denial at the same level as creationists who deny evolution. And yes, that was not quite directed at creationists, that was directed at the handful of people who are inevitably going to be commenting on this video about how, oh, Rhino, you're good at following the science when it comes to evolution and religion, but it's so sad that you just gave up that religion for the religion of climate change alarmism. So feel free to comment something along those lines anyway, it does help feed the algorithm after all, but you are demonstrably wrong.
And if temperature goes beyond a certain threshold, it'll be catastrophic for life on Earth. That's called anthropogenic global warming.
Life as a whole will probably survive in one form or another, but it is generally agreed that we are either at the beginning of or in the middle of the 6th mass extinction event that Earth has experienced. And this one is being caused by humans. Now, the human activity that is causing that is not limited to climate change, but it certainly does include it.
That leads to a key point that we need to clarify here. It's not just, is there climate change, but are humans to blame?
Yes.
Yes. As Richard just so clearly said, but obviously wasn't answering your question, the answer to both of those questions is unequivocally yes. We know that carbon dioxide absorbs and re-emits infrared energy as heat. We know that humans have dumped a shit ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere over the last 150 years, with the current CO2 levels being higher than they've been in the past 3 million years, and the swing from low CO2 to high CO2 happening much faster than it ever has in the history of the planet. And we see the rise in global average temperatures corresponding directly to the rise in gases that we know have the effect of trapping heat in the system. Then we also see the runaway effects of this warming. A warmer atmosphere on a planet with this much water means more water vapor in the atmosphere. Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas, so the planet warms more, which then adds more water vapor into the atmosphere, etc. Now, the oceans actually do have a bit of a protective effect. CO2 can be dissolved into water as carbonic acid, which then has the effect of changing the pH of the water, which wreaks havoc on the delicate coral reef ecosystems, and on top of all that, isn't enough to offset just how much carbon we put into the atmosphere in the first place.
Now, we're covering this topic because it has a lot to do with worldviews. A view of the world, an all-encompassing perspective on everything that exists and matters to us.
It's not a worldview issue, though. This isn't like the creation versus evolution debate where you guys can hide behind the fact that we can't exactly recreate past events and then call that a difference in perspective. We're talking about the creationist favorite kind of science here. Observational science that we are doing right now, today, as we directly observe all of these things happening. If you don't believe that CO2 has a warming effect, there are experiments that you can do yourself to demonstrate it. If you don't believe that humans have increased the CO2 content of the atmosphere, then I really don't know what to tell you with that one, because that's just flat out denial. You do it every time you drive a car, likely even if that car is fully electric. And while I'm not going to get into the weeds on the electric car thing, I will just quickly point out in response to the common criticism that it's electricity made by burning coal, that when you take into account the efficiency of an electric engine versus an internal combustion engine, even if 100% of the electricity for the electric motor was made by burning coal, it will result in fewer emissions than the internal combustion engine. Now, sure, coal is obviously not the ideal power source for that. In a perfect world, it would be a mix of nuclear and renewables, but it's still better for the environment than a typical gas engine. And now the anti-nuclear crowd are mad at me. Welcome to the video where I try as hard as I can to piss off as many people as possible. Rather than address the nuclear power thing here, I'll just leave a link down below to an article that goes over some of the most common concerns with it, so you can go down that rabbit hole if you so desire.
And different worldviews will produce different reactions and actions to the topic of climate change.
Yeah, that much is true. The people in governmental positions who look at climate change through the lens of their religion are typically less inclined to want to do anything about it, even though the Bible does tell you to take care of the earth, as these guys themselves admit in a bit that I'm about to skip. They summarize the parts of their worldview that impact how they look at climate change, and to just read through the main points quicker, the world was created through and for Jesus, but it was also created for mankind. We are called to be blameless, Christ holds his creation together, worship the Creator, not the creation, and we are supposed to be good stewards of creation. And I think we can all see what angle they're going for here. God made the world for us, and he will hold it together himself. Taking too much care of the environment counts as worshiping the creation rather than the Creator, and the bits about us being good stewards can mostly be ignored because it's arrogant to think that we are even capable of destroying something that God is actively holding together.
Christians, we affirm that we have responsibility to look after the environment. We are also compelled to consider the poor and the general welfare of our neighbors, among other things.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Let's talk about that for a moment. Do you know who is most affected by the impacts of climate change? Those living in poverty. When Puerto Rico was hit by Hurricane Maria in 2017, the wealthy were able to leave the island and use their resources to have their homes rebuilt, while the poor cannot leave the island and have to wait for emergency assistance to have their homes rebuilt, if that even happens. Future Rhino cutting in. I am aware that not everybody with financial means left the island while their homes were being rebuilt, but there were some who did, and that makes for a more sharp contrast that shows that people who are able to move around will be impacted by climate change to a much lesser degree than those who cannot. The long-term health effects disproportionately impact poor communities. Now, was Hurricane Maria directly caused by climate change? Well, with any one particular event, it's impossible to say conclusively, but what is universally agreed upon is that severe weather events, like Hurricane Maria, will increase in frequency as climate change gets worse. But it can be more direct than that as well. Even if you don't believe that climate change is caused by humans, reducing pollution can have an enormous impact on public health, particularly in poor communities, though certainly not exclusive to them. According to the WHO, in the 15 countries with the highest greenhouse gas emissions, the health impacts of air pollution are estimated to cost more than 4% of those countries' GDP. A review published in 2008 found that the direct medical costs that are the result of pollution are estimated to be around $40 billion per year, with an additional $5 billion in intangible costs. And then a more recent analysis found that the total societal costs from air pollution in the US alone were about $131 billion, with the majority of those costs coming from public health, with the majority of people directly impacted by poor air quality living in poor neighborhoods. So if you care about helping the poor, it seems that you would want to clean up the air that they breathe. So if you actually care about helping the poor, it seems that you would want to clean up the air that they breathe. Lowering emissions is an incredibly effective way to do that. And as a bonus, if you care about the economy as well, the cost of reducing emissions would be mostly, if not entirely, offset by the decreased cost of healthcare for people impacted by poor air quality. So if your goal is, as you said, to care about the poor and the general welfare of your neighbors, and you still refuse to believe that climate change is caused by people, you should still want to reduce emissions because emissions reduction aligns perfectly with those goals, even if we ignore the overall picture of climate change.
Building on from there, we need to be mindful of the real history of the world from the Bible.
Yes.
Especially those events that would impact climate change and the climate change debate.
I mean, you're wrong about those things, but in this case they are entirely irrelevant. We don't need to look at what happened in the past, although it can certainly provide insight. There is enough evidence and data to show that climate change is happening now, and is being caused by people now, even if we ignore all the data from before we started keeping track of temperatures ourselves.
And we'll contrast this history with the naturalistic history and worldview where there is no God. So everything came from nothing, natural processes over billions of years. Humans are no more important than cows or trees or cockroaches for that matter.
Oh, yeah.
Now, there's a lot going on here, but what I want to address is the humans are no more important than other life part. Because inherently, that is correct-ish. I guess it really depends on how you define important. Personally, when drawing the line between organisms that are important and organisms that are not, I would draw that line somewhere in between those that are sapient and those that are not. Killing a bug that has no capacity for thought is not a problem, but killing a human who not only has the capacity for thought but also self-awareness and self-reflection is and should be a crime. We could have a very long discussion about which animals might or might not be sapient, and which animals have the potential for sapience but cannot be conclusively tested, and whether or not sapience would even always manifest itself in a way that we currently expect. But all of that is outside the scope of this video. I just wanted to make it clear that while I don't put humans above the rest of the organisms on the Earth in the same sense that a creationist might, our capacity for sapience does set us apart, even if it's not an exclusive club.
Nice.
You see, some claim that the environment was, fine for hundreds of millions of years until man came along and messed it up.
No, that is not the claim. Nobody who is advocating for cleaning up the environment will tell you that the environment has always been the same, in perfect balance and harmony, until humans came along and screwed it up. Well, nobody who knows what they're talking about at any rate. The problem is that humans are screwing it up at an accelerated rate. Carbon levels have not been constant over time, but they have never changed as fast as they are changing now. Carbon emissions over the last 60 years have increased the carbon concentration of the atmosphere 100 times faster than any previous natural carbon increase. That's the issue here. If it was happening slowly, stuff could adapt to that, but it's not.
But in the biblical view, from the beginning, humans were created to care for and rule over the earth.
And when we're spending billions of dollars per year on medical costs that are directly related to pollution exposure, we're not doing a very good job of that, from anyone's perspective.
Yeah, and those are really different worldviews.
Right.
Can we not all agree that breathing fresh, clean air is preferable to breathing polluted, smoggy air? Why does your worldview lead you to believe that smoggy air is preferable here, even when you claim that you believe we're supposed to be taking care of the planet and the people on it?
Now, another major historical event related to climate change happened about 4,500 years ago. Noah's flood covered the earth in water and buried massive amounts of vegetation and animals, turning them into coal and other fossil fuels.
And if I hypothetically grant your completely ahistorical and ridiculous event for the sake of argument, how would you say that life on Earth handled that particular climatic event? Would you say that it all came out of that one unscathed? Or did maybe most of everything die? Why would you point to an event where you believe the climate killed literally everything on the planet except for one boatload of refugees as an example of why we don't need to worry about the climate?
Nearly all of today's coal was formed from the vegetation buried during Noah's flood. The huge amount of buried vegetation suggests that pre-flood CO2 levels must have been very high compared to today levels.
Although pre-flood is a ridiculous way to refer to it, in the past there were much higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere than there are today. In the Ordovician, CO2 levels were between 3 and 9,000 parts per million. For reference, they're at about 420 parts per million today, and were at about 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. This higher concentration of CO2 in the Ordovician led to global average temperatures that were around 10 degrees Celsius higher than they are today. And climate change deniers will point to this and say, see, life survived then, so it's no big deal. And while it may be true that if the Earth had stayed hot while humanity evolved, we'd probably have been fine, it's the transition that is the real killer. We've got more extreme weather events killing people and making previously inhabitable land uninhabitable, resulting in climate refugees. There have already been an estimated 21.5 million climate refugees since 2008, and that number's only expected to get bigger, with projections that there will be an estimated 1.2 billion people displaced by climate change and natural disasters by 2050. So, yeah, if all those people had just happened to live somewhere that wouldn't be affected all that much by climate change, they'd probably have been fine. But the fact of the matter is that they did not, and in the future will not.
Even secular geologists agree that ancient Paleozoic CO2 levels were much higher, like even 15 times more than they are today. Yeah.
Way higher.
Yeah, there's no evidence that the Earth was, cooked by this situation of, a runaway greenhouse effect or something. The much higher CO2 levels would boost plant productivity and also allow for much more animal biomass.
Again, if these changes were to happen very, very gradually, allowing the plant and animal life to adapt, then maybe, yeah. But when it happens significantly faster, well accompanied by deforestation I might add, this lush green garden planet that you're picturing is not what you end up with. Not only are humans pumping a bunch of CO2 into the atmosphere, we're also actively removing the plants that are the most responsible for sequestering it, which probably doesn't help.
Right, yeah. Another key event to consider is that the flood created ideal conditions for an ice age for a few hundred years following the flood. These were both catastrophic climate events.
Okay, first, to address the on-screen text, which just lists when they think the last ice age ended, we're actually still in an ice age. The modern ice age is in an interglaciation period, with the last glaciation ending about 11,000 years ago. And no, the climate was not designed to be stable. But if you think that it was, then the current instability of the climate should be even more concerning to you, should it not? You have to ignore an awful lot of data that's just sitting there staring you right in the face in order to claim that the current climate is stable.
Since then, there have been, comparatively minor fluctuations in climate. Our environment is designed to be reasonably stable. As Genesis 8:22 suggests, while earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease.
Well, maybe you're aware of one that I'm not, but I don't know of any climate scientists saying that those things are going to cease altogether. The summers and winters will be warmer, barring extreme events like the disruption of the jet stream, which was caused by warming but ended up with severe extreme cold weather events. Seed time and harvest will still be a thing, but droughts and floods will get in the way in a lot of places. Summer and winter will exist as long as the Earth's axial tilt remains, but their characteristics will change. Same with day and night. So even if I accept this verse at face value, it does not exclude climate change from being an option. Now, I'm skipping there a bit about whether there was an ice age 4,000 years ago or many ice ages over the course of the Earth's history, because it's irrelevant to climate change. Climate change is one area of science where creationists can't hide behind our inability to perfectly replicate past events, because it is happening right now, right in front of us. So, who fucking cares whether it was one ice age or several? We're killing ourselves with the climate right now, where you can see it in front of your face.
Another event to consider is that, yes, God created everything very good originally, but because Adam sinned, creation is cursed and is in a state of decay.
Is that how you dismiss the very obvious evidence of climate change? Dismiss it as being part of the curse, even though the curse on the earth was just that weeds would grow and now farming would be hard? I guess that explains why you don't care about the fact that pollution reduction would help immensely, even if we ignore the impact it would have on the climate. The world's going to shit, and the sooner it gets there, the sooner it'll be the apocalypse, and we can go live with God in heaven and take joy in the billions of people who will then be cast into eternal torture. What a dark outlook you have.
Romans 8 says that the creation was subjected to futility and is currently in bondage to corruption. But God promises to restore this decaying creation, turning it into the new heavens and new earth where believers will spend eternity with him.
Yup, there it is. I thought I had to explain it for those that would miss the implication that that was there, but nope, turns out I just had to let him keep talking. Who cares about this Earth? It's gonna get destroyed in the apocalypse anyway. The next one will be better. Well, my take on this might be a little bit crazy, but I vote that we take proper care of the only Earth that we know for sure that we get, and then if a better one comes along later, we can deal with that then.
The book of Revelation describes future events and talks about this current earth as, past tense, saying the first
Right.
heaven and the first earth had passed away.
Yes.
So what happened to it being too stable to be messed up? And as long as we're going to go to Revelation, it also talks about Jesus carrying a sword around in his mouth, and a beast with 7 heads but 10 crowns. Forgive me for not taking such an obvious mushroom trip at face value.
Christians have, been commanded to look after the earth, but our hope is in something far better that's yet to come.
Yeah, and naturalism doesn't offer a hope like
No.
that.
Right. We don't have fantasies about golden cities where everybody will be happy all the time to cling to. We have to deal with this thing called reality, where we have to make our own hope, which is incredibly hard to do with people like you trotting around spouting all this, "Oh, don't worry about that, the next Earth will be so much better" nonsense.
So you can see why naturalists might want to overemphasize or even distort the severity of climate change. You think this Earth is that's all we have, right? Or Elon Musk, the CEO of SpaceX, wants to make humans a multiplanetary species. One of the reasons he wants to colonize Mars is so that humans could survive an extinction event on Earth, like World War III or climate change.
Right.
And the main problem with Musk's idea there is that it would take a lot more resources to make a habitat on Mars that is capable of sustaining human life with no support from Earth than it would to just take care of the planet that we already evolved to inhabit. I guess add the Elon Musk stands to the people that I'm pissing off with this video. Yay, it's a fun video today.
God is sovereign.
Right.
He's in control of history and weather and all the creation, guiding it to the end that he's decreed, despite all attempts by humans to control their destiny.
And there we go. Don't worry about it, God'll take care of it. Now, his taking care of it will either result in him mass murdering billions of people as per the book of Revelation, or it'll just be him letting it keep getting worse and worse until it finally gets to the revelation point in the future. But he'll take care of it. But again, even if you sincerely believe this with all of your heart, why would you be against lowering pollution levels to make everybody's lives better in the meantime, even if pollution has 0 effect on climate? Why do you not want to help poor people who are disproportionately affected by pollution? When I was a Christian, I thought it was arrogant to assume that humans had the ability to mess with a climate that God had designed, so I didn't think that climate change was man-made. But I still supported all of the same things as people who want to fight climate change, because even though I disagreed with the end results, I could still see that a world with less pollution is a better world to live in.
He made us caretakers, but we have a limited amount of control there.
That's right.
So why would we not exercise that control? You seem to be advocating for a sit-back-and-do-nothing approach. That is not good stewardship. That's the guy who buried his talent in the ground and did nothing with it. You, right now, are behaving in a way that Jesus described as wicked and slothful by advocating for a do-nothing approach to the environment. Worse, I'd say, because at least the servant who buried the talent still had the original talent with the same value. You are advocating for spending the talent without the master's permission, and then returning to him with significantly less than what he originally gave you.
For naturalists, if there's no God and if humans are responsible for destroying the environment, then I guess it's assumed that only humans can fix it.
Fix it, right, yeah.
Well, the dolphins sure aren't going to fix this for us. They'll be too busy evacuating. But seriously though, did you miss the part of childhood where your parents taught you to clean up after yourself? You make the mess, you're responsible for cleaning it up. Would you disagree that pollution exists and is a problem for human health? We've made a mess here. Who is going to clean it up? Even if God exists, we should do our best to clean it up before he comes for the final inspection.
Well, here are 5 considerations about how science works and how this impacts the science of climate change. One basic tenet of science is that it is testable.
Right.
Yeah. And you can do experiments yourself that are not all that hard to set up that show that CO2 has a warming effect. We can measure the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. We can see the global average temperatures rising as the concentration of a warming gas rises. These are all testable and have been tested.
In climate science, the observation is that global temperature has been going up as well as the level of CO2. The hypothesis is that CO2 released into the atmosphere by human activity is causing the higher temperature.
Yeah, but you're leaving out that we observe that CO2 has a warming effect. That is an observation, not an hypothesis. Given that information, when we see warming happen in tandem with increase of a warming gas, CO2, then we know that at the very least, the CO2 is a contributing factor. And we don't just assume that all of the warming is caused by CO2. Researchers are constantly looking for other contributors to the warming, and they've found several. But the top contributors all have one thing in common. They wouldn't be there if not for humans. These gases include methane, nitrous oxide, PFCs, HFCs, and hexafluoride. These should definitely not be ignored. Taken together, their effect on warming is about equivalent to CO2. The reason CO2 gets all the attention, though, is right there in the comparison. It takes all 5 of those gases, plus the still present but mostly banned CFCs, to equal the effects of the single gas CO2.
Now, the problem is that it's not possible to design a repeatable experiment to test this hypothesis.
That's right.
Because of the size, complexity, and uniqueness of the system.
An experiment does not need to absolutely perfectly duplicate everything that happens in nature in order to be conclusive. In fact, that would make the experiment kind of useless. We need to isolate variables by getting rid of the extraneous stuff to make sure that what we're seeing is actually the result of that one particular thing. Do you deny that carbon dioxide has a warming effect? Because that can be experimentally verified, and the experiment is so easy that when you look it up, the instructions contain phrases like, "have an adult help you." Why would carbon dioxide not have a warming effect on the climate as a whole when it is so easy to demonstrate its warming effect that you can do it in an experiment designed for children too young to use scissors? You guys even agreed that higher CO2 levels in the past resulted in warmer temperatures. Why would it be any different now?
I mean, after all, there's only one planet Earth, and it's rather complicated.
A little, yeah.
So we're left with conjectures and predictions. Applying statistical models to the past temperature data can generate a prediction for the future, but the confidence limits are so wide that the predictions are, kind of useless.
Well, a retrospective analysis of climate models published between 1970 and 2007 found that, quote, climate models published over the past 5 decades were skillful in predicting subsequent global mean surface temperature changes, with most models examined showing warming consistent with observations. And given the nature of climate modeling, we would only expect it to get more accurate as we develop new technologies that can take more accurate and precise readings. So, yeah, when we look back at past models, they are pretty damn accurate. I would consider that to be adequate evidence that the modeling scientists know what they're doing with their models.
Yeah, and this approach can't say whether CO2 is causing the change.
Right.
So the climate models that predict a temperature response to CO2 have to be deterministic. That is, they have to assume that the inputs will determine the temperature.
Over 50 years of modeling data shows that to have been a valid assumption, even though it was never really an assumption to begin with. So, you don't think it's the CO2, you think it's something else, and that 50 years of dozens of independently constructed climate models all just happen to match up with what we would expect if human emissions were the cause? Do you have anything to even add to the discussion here? Any ideas about what is really causing the warming that you cannot deny is happening? Or is this just another instance of, if I poke enough holes in the accepted scientific consensus, then I'm automatically right about creation?
So the assertion, based on these models, that CO2 causes global warming is actually circular reasoning. And
Right.
that's a big no-no in science.
Yes, it is.
Even if it was at one point, which it wasn't, I feel like the continued accuracy of the climate models has taken it out of the realm of circular reasoning by this point.
Okay, so the second point is that science cannot prove theories to be true, only false.
Right.
And in order to prove something false, you need to bring data to the table that shows it to be false, and preferably also a competing hypothesis that better fits that data. That's not an easy thing to do for climate change, given how well the idea that it's caused by man-made emissions fits the data.
Observing a result, predicted by a hypothesis, that doesn't prove the hypothesis, as there may be other explanations. So higher temperatures, for example, could be the result of something other than CO2.
It's possible, yeah.
Yeah.
Such as... You gonna suggest anything? You just gonna leave it hanging? Are you bringing anything to the discussion, or are you just shitting on everything else?
But if the data shows higher temperatures with lower levels of CO2, that would disprove the hypothesis.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so no competing ideas, just science can only prove things false, therefore we're going to ignore the data that we don't like and just claim that it's inconclusive because of the tentative nature of science in general.
Number 3, correlation doesn't mean causation.
Well, no, but when there is a correlation with well-understood mechanisms that do link it to causation, and there's no other data that correlates with this particular set, and there's no competing hypotheses that explain the data better than the one that we already have, then we definitely have a reason to accept that there is a causal link in this case.
For example, between June and December of 2008, both the temperature in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and the Toronto Stock Exchange decreased dramatically. But no one has ever blamed the stock market for the plunge in Calgary weather.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay.
No causation there.
No, they haven't. Because it's missing a plausible mechanism, and the correlation does not remain consistent over the long term. But for climate change, we don't just have a plausible mechanism, we have an extremely well understood mechanism by which CO2 can have a warming effect, and the correlation of CO2 levels and global average temperatures has remained consistently correlated for over a century now. That's a pretty solid link.
Okay, number 4, science is often captured by a ruling paradigm. A paradigm is a framework used by default to interpret data. For example, since mainstream science is dominated by naturalism, conclusions that include a creator or intelligent designer are automatically excluded.
Yeah.
As well they should be. I have yet to see a single instance of someone advocating for creation or intelligent design explaining an actual mechanism for anything that they think God did. It doesn't help us learn about how the world works to get to an unknown and then declare that because we don't know how it works, it must have been God. That would stymie scientific progress. So the best course of action here, even if God exists, is to try and figure out how things work without supernatural intervention, because that is the only way we have ever made any scientific progress.
In climate science, this can be leaving out explanations other than man-made CO2.
Right.
Is your competing hypothesis the idea that God is just roasting us? Okay, brilliant. Now, kindly provide some data that shows how this has happened independent of human emissions, but somehow still perfectly correlates with human emissions.
Number 5, peer review lends credibility to research, but it doesn't ensure truth necessarily.
While this is true, there is so much peer-reviewed research on the subject of climate change at this point that to deny climate change is caused by people is to deny reality. So, yeah, don't trust any one peer-reviewed paper just on the grounds that it is peer-reviewed, but if the peer-reviewed papers on a particular subject keep coming to the same conclusion every single time, we're talking thousands if not millions of papers going back to the late 1800s here, then maybe, just maybe, all these climate scientists might be onto something. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Call Me Mr. Pig.
They call me Mr. Pig!
Who says, so just to confirm, evolution shouldn't be believed because we can't observe it in real time, and therefore we should believe in Christian creation. Did I understand that correctly? Yes, you did. And not only should we not believe in evolution because we can't observe it in real time, but we should also not believe in climate change despite the fact that we can observe it in real time, because the climate is complicated. So obviously there's some other reason for it that they can't explain, demonstrate, or even articulate. Bit of housekeeping before I go. I have been summoned for jury duty, and the jury selection day is this coming Monday. The most likely outcome is that I'll just lose a day of work and so might skip my live stream next week to make it up, but it is also possible that the selection process will take all week and I won't be able to get a video done for next Friday. So most likely, you guys won't notice anything different. Videos will be showing up on Fridays as usual, but if there isn't a video next Friday, this is why. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Clench Eastwood, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, Tim, Stephanie Lawrence, Lars Cade, Borealis German, Luciano Pasiornik, Book of Job, Akamitsu, Eris Culpepper, Lars Zachariasen, Pumpkin J, Elizabeth, and all the rest, who are the carbon dioxide to the planets that are my channel. If you'd like to turn me into some hot balls, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Now you'll even get to hear me mispronounce your name. You can also support the channel through one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time. Earth's sixth mastic... God, it's too many sounds. Earth's sixth mass extinction... So why would it be different now? You know how those of you, when I do a video with my face, you ask if I wave my hands around when I don't show my face? Yeah, I do. That's what you just heard.